Hi, I'm Greg. Peter was up here on stage earlier on. I co-head the climate investing strategy here at Fifthwall with him. I am Tweedledum to his Tweedledee. And when we think about regulations, I think a lot of people think about compliance checking the box. When it comes to the collision of the real estate industry and climate change, the thing is here around regulations, we've actually got two things going on. One is we've got a whole bunch of sticks, right? We've got things like Local Law 97 in New York. It's rushing up on all of us very, very quickly. We've got similar regulations like that in pretty much every large city around the States and definitely in Europe. So lots of sticks that we should all be worried about. However, the nice thing here is that we do also have massive buckets of money. We've got the IRA out there, the Inflation Reduction Act. I think we should be playing bingo around the number of times the IRA gets mentioned today. It has got $8 billion in it for putting things like heat pumps into buildings. That's awesome. That's a big whack of money. People also forget that there's actually $30 billion of annual utility incentives out there every single year. More free money. And around EV chargers, depending who you trust in the IRA, there's somewhere around about $200 billion of money in that bucket there. So when it comes to regulations, I think a lot of us think of it as boring compliance. Yes, there's some compliance here for things like Local Law 97, but as investors in real estate and really looking at the bottom line profitability of our buildings, we should never forget the free money. So with that preamble here, I would love to introduce, we've got Rebecca, Jeff, Adam, and Cody on our panel. And just going down the line here, maybe give us 30 seconds on who you are, where you fit in your organization, and why you're so excited about regulations.
Okay, hey everybody, I'm Becker with Equity Residential. We're a large multifamily REIT, mostly in coastal markets, but we have some inland now, Denver, Atlanta, Texas. I run our energy, environmental, climate adaptation programs. I actually love compliance. It's been what I've been doing my whole career. So I'm excited to be on a panel and talk about the compliance and how we're making it fun and exciting.
Great. Jeff Carleton, CEO of Runwise. We build online controls that help buildings actually operate their systems more efficiently. I'm excited to be here because regulation and incentives sort of force people to operate efficient properties. We're getting away from kind of set it and forget it and hope you run an efficient building to requirements. So it is exciting that we're focused on forcing people to run more efficient properties.
I'm Adam Kramer, CEO of nZero. We are a real-time carbon accounting and carbon management platform, helping organizations understand their environmental impact and how to make decisions to reduce that. And the question I've never been asked before, why am I excited about regulations? I think that the excitement about it is that it forces us to have a ground truth and an honest conversation about sustainability that holds everybody accountable, and it's an exciting time.
Hey, I'm Cody Finke, and I'm the co-founder and CEO of Brimstone. So Brimstone is working on decarbonizing the world's cement production. For those of you who don't know, cement is responsible for the same amount of CO2 emissions as cars globally, so it's quite a bit. And we've developed a new process to make it without CO2. And then why do I love regulation? Well, I don't, but if I had to tell you why, free money would be near the top of the list. Like previously, spending money was good, but free money is much better. And then there's also quite a bit of regulation that will help speed along decarbonization of cement, just like we saw, old processes to make electricity, like coal-fired power plants, be replaced with the help of regulation. And we've seen a lot of the same things for cement. So excited to talk about that.
Absolutely. Well, this is our esteemed panel. Thank you very much for taking the time. Let's maybe start out where the rubber meets the road at really an end user customer here, Equity Residential. I think a lot of people historically have thought of compliance and regulatory stuff as, either you have a compliance department and you make sure they check the box over there, or you maybe, when it comes to regulations, just make sure your general counsel is sort of on top of it and not really something you think about. Does that cut it today? And if not, how do you really need to integrate this into all of the operations across a company like Equity Residential?
Yeah, so we still have those departments, but I don't think they're working in silos when it comes to sustainability and energy compliance. So we have, Equity has large corporate portfolio emissions goals. That's one thing that we work on. It drives some of the decisions we make on where we invest and what we do. But with the influx over the last several years of building energy performance standards, or BEPS programs, and really the local state natural gas bans, that's starting to drive our compliance requirements beyond just portfolio-wide. And the benefit that we see from that is it helps us to really prioritize where we want to invest our time and our resources to measure, evaluate, study our assets, and then eventually implement and execute on projects. How do we do that at Equity? Well, we have a team of 6 that work on sustainability energy programs corporate-wide, and then we work with everybody in our facilities team, capitals team to execute. But we have a few data analysts. Data is a big part of understanding what our emissions are, what we have, where we need to focus. And then they help us measure projects and understand results so we know where to execute further. We have a building systems engineer. I'm not an engineer, so I need somebody that helps us really understand the technical side of how to execute these projects and what we should be doing and where we should be investing and spending our time. And then I sort of take the regulatory piece, and I spend a lot of time working with local cities and states and different agencies to help develop and fine-tune policies. Most of them are not final, even though they're final. And so you really need to get in there, work with them, make sure they understand our industry. A lot of time the regulators aren't understanding that the way they're developing the policies is not going to be helpful and not going to be feasible. So we spend a lot of time doing that to make it work for commercial real estate and then specifically for us, for multifamily. And so that's kind of where we're at.
So there's a lot going on there.
There's a lot.
Let's actually maybe use a real world example here. You know, it was sort of at the beginning of the summer we started seeing these headlines that Joe Biden was going to come and rip out your gas stove and force you to cook, I don't know, on hot coals or something, right? You start seeing regulations like that in news headlines. They haven't actually yet been written yet, but you know they're probably inevitably going to come down the pike in some way, shape, or form. How do you as an organization even start to think about this or tackle it or build it into your future building designs? Because I assume you've got, you know, a backlog of 10 years of buildings or something out there that you're thinking about, right?
Yep, it's a little Frogger-like. We are, for example, Cambridge, up until literally the 11th hour when they finalized their BEPS program, multifamily was included. It was pulled out like 5 minutes before the final vote. And we had been planning for compliance in 2025 for Cambridge properties. Now we don't need to for now. And so it is tough. I don't know that we have an answer. My goal is to be on top of it so we don't miss something, and I'd rather plan ahead and be prepared and then not have to do the work than kind of sit and wait and hope it doesn't happen. But if somebody's figured out how to know exactly what's gonna happen, I'd love to hear from them.
Yeah, I think we'd all be making a lot more money if we knew what the government was going to do in the future. Adam, moving on to you, because it sounds like most of the things that Rebecca's trying to do need to be very data-driven, right? Like, where does the data come from? How do people keep track of it? And yeah, what are the toughest things about collecting all of this data in one place?
Yeah, the data is obviously inherently the challenge, right? Because when you think about sustainability data, it's coming from all of your operational and capital decisions you're making every single day. And so now we're saying, well, how do we apply this lens to it to understand that impact? And to date, what you've seen in the market is a lot of people will use, very coarse data in what is most easily available, right? So when you have a large real estate portfolio, you reach out to property managers, say, hey, send me your utility bills, send me, if you're doing LCAs, like did we do any construction projects, send me this, and people collect that data. And it creates its own challenges. You're adding workload to people and you create errors every time you involve humans in data. And so one of the things we've done at nZero is to focus on automating that data collection across this board, not just to help reduce those errors, but as you have large portfolios that have regulations, whether you're in New York City or you're in Denver, you're in Washington, is how do you stay compliant and understand where all of these regulations are? Because that's another piece of data that's outside of your immediate data set, and bring that into the compliance. And then once you have that, what do you do with it, right? We talked a lot about sticks here, in the setup, and you have these sticks that say, hey, if you don't do this, you will face a penalty. So what do we do with this data? And then that's what, at nZero we're focused on is, so how do we take that data and through generative AI tools, help produce energy audits, understand what are the retrofits or interventions you can take day to day in a real-time nature, right? Because that's how businesses operate. They don't operate once a quarter or once a year. They operate every single day. So how do we get that data in a real-time basis to do it? And at the end of the day, what's driving all of this is that real estate is the first place in the United States where there's a cost of carbon. The cost of carbon in New York City is $250 per ton. The cost of carbon in the state of Maryland is $268 per ton. The cost of carbon in California is almost $300 per ton. So for once, we're finally applying an actual price of carbon here. So it's probably the better answers to why I'm excited about regulation is because that, as much as anything, is helping to move people forward. And there's very few people like Rebecca who are as progressive and working ahead of this on the regulation. That you're very much an outlier in the most positive of ways about what you're doing. Most people are struggling still to get the data and file an initial GRESB report, let alone facing everything else coming down.
Okay, so you actually just said something pretty controversial there, because as far as I know, America does not have a cost of carbon, right? There are no federal regulations or anything like that on the book. What do you actually mean by that? Why does New York have a price of carbon implied?
Yeah, so Local Law 97, for those not familiar, is a local building regulation, performance regulation there. And basically what it does is it sets a benchmark per square foot of a building that they need to hit as far as looking at all of their utilities. So energy, gas, and sometimes steam were available, and understand what is that carbon intensity per square foot. They have their own localized emission factors, just to add more complexity to everything here on top of this. So not the emissions factors we all use on our traditional reporting. And the benchmarks continue to rise year after year. So starting in 2030, they get more and more progressive. Today, I believe it is something like 85% or so of buildings, maybe higher than that, maybe 90% of buildings will be in compliance with the initial standards set forth by Local Law 97. By the time it reaches its top tier of the benchmark, it'll be 10% or less that will actually reach that. And so how they're penalizing people is saying, when you calculate the carbon intensity of our building and say it's 100,000 metric tons of carbon intensity, and my benchmark's 90,000 tons, for every metric ton, I will be paying $250 per metric ton of carbon. So it is where a price of carbon now actually exists in New York City within that parameter of that regulation.
And as far as I understand, that is a fine to the building owner that's going to be very difficult to pass through to a tenant.
Very difficult. And I will tell you, on the initial work we've done with customers in New York City, we've seen building owners who are facing six-figure plus annual fines based off of where their building is today and where that benchmark ultimately goes to at full implementation. So the cost is quite dramatic, and to your point, it's really hard to pass on.
Yeah, you put that sort of cost in terms of fines and put a nice cap rate on it, and that's real money on your buildings, right? So let's actually maybe talk a little bit about solutions. What can we do about this? So Jeff, Runwise actually has something to prevent your buildings burning as much natural gas as they do. So maybe talk a little bit about what can you do here to help solve this?
Sure. The main thing you can do if you really want to keep it as simple as possible is look at the fuel and oil that you are burning in your building and say, what actually turns this thing on and off? So if you've got a boiler or whatever type of heating setup or system you have, it's a really simple question. For example, like if you order a Domino's pizza or something like that, right? You buy it and you know exactly where it is and you know exactly when it's coming to your doorstep. But surprisingly, people don't operate most heating or central systems like that. They put in an older control. If it's a certain temperature, it turns on, it turns off. And it's really just blind luck if they run an efficient building. There's no actual data behind it. No one is actually paying any attention to it. So that's really the problem that we realize at Runwise. I just realized it by, like any other New York City person, getting frustrated with overheated buildings and open windows and closed radiators, if that's familiar to anybody. And that is the actual, in this climate environment, in this regulatory local law 97 Birdo BEPS, that's how 90 some odd % of people are still running their buildings today. We go to these conferences, we talk about it, then we go back to the old way of running buildings, which is from the 50s. So Runwise is a relatively simple solution. It's basically a thermostat for properties. So instead of just like one little Nest thermostat that everybody is used to, it's sort of the equivalent of 30 of them that talk to any sort of heating or cooling or central system in a property and run it to hit a target temperature. Just through that simple measure, I'm not an engineer, not a PE, that simple concept can help buildings, what I say, reduce their number to the lowest possible amount. So you don't need to go and spend huge money on massive projects until you've sort of done your homework, meaning that you've turned off every system you have and you're running it only when necessary. If you've done that, you'll be well below the 2024 requirements, and then you'll typically won't be that far outside of, let's say, a 2030 requirement in, let's say, local law 97. So Runwise really helps you run the most efficient possible property you have with what you have.
Yeah, actually, my favorite factoid about those New York radiators, given we just came out of a pandemic, if anybody remembers that happening, the radiators in New York City apartments were coded to be the size so that in the 1911 flu pandemic, you could have the windows wide open for ventilation in the middle of winter, and the radiators would still keep your apartment warm and you wouldn't die. That's fun, still around, 115 years later. And people often say that, no, don't worry, the real estate industry is going to update all of its building codes really rapidly, right? Yeah, it's pretty slow moving. And with that, I think we should move on to Cody, because so far today, we've really been talking about operational carbon. This is really the energy that is going into running your building, heating and cooling it, keeping the lights on. The red-headed stepchild, maybe, of carbon emissions is what we call embodied carbon. So, Cody, what is embodied carbon, and why do we all of a sudden have to start caring about something else?
I know, it's exhausting. So embodied carbon is the carbon emissions that are represented by the building materials that you use to build your building. So it takes energy to operate a cement plant, and it takes energy to operate a steel plant and a refinery, and all of these materials go into making a building, and all of that energy also represents CO2 emissions. And it turns out about 40% of the emissions from a building happen before anyone steps inside that building, right? 40% of the emissions are embodied carbon. And cement specifically is the largest single source of those emissions, right? So it's 15% of emissions from buildings come from just cement. And it's kind of an interesting story because cement emissions come from two places. They come from both energy, as in we use energy to make cement, and they also come from the rock itself. So when we make cement today, we use a rock that is about half CO2 by mass, and we burn off all that CO2, and what's left behind is cement. And at Brimstone, my company, we developed a new chemical process to make that exact same cement, right? So if you're building a building, there is nothing you would have to change at all if you used our cement, right? It's just a new process to make that exact same cement, ordinary Portland cement. But we use a rock that does not contain CO2. And in fact, instead of making CO2 as a waste product, we make a waste product that sequesters carbon. So under a typical energy scenario, which is certainly not clean right now, although hopefully it will be soon, we're still typically carbon negative because of that waste product. So we can solve the largest portion of that embodied carbon problem. And as I mentioned in the beginning, there's a lot of regulation that is helping to speed that along.
Yeah, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention the other side of regulation is standardization, and Brimstone actually just received ASTM certification on their cement, so it is drop-in replacement and proven that you don't need to change your building codes to get new technology out there. But you did mention new regulation coming down the pike. I think the fastest mover here in terms of embodied carbon is the state of California requiring clean concrete in their buildings. Can you maybe talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so yeah, that's right. There in California, there's two really important pieces of regulation. So the first is Cal Green, which is the building codes in California, which now have a embodied carbon metric that at this point only eliminates the worst polluting cement, but you cannot build a building in California and meet code without following these regulations. And there's also a law called SB 596, and that makes it so in the state of California, you'll not be able to use anything besides zero carbon cement by the year 2045. And these Cal Green regulations are sort of the first step that will slowly notch down to zero from where it is today. And as you just mentioned, Greg, Brimstone just got third-party certification that we are the first and only company that's able to make the exact same cement that is conventionally used. So if you happen to be a real estate developer and you want to build a building that you're as confident as any other building won't fall down, then you probably want to use ordinary Portland cement, and we're the only company that can make it without CO2 and comply with California regulation.
This is why we like Brimstone so much. Okay, well, let's maybe jump into some devil's advocate questions, because you just said 2045. That's like a long time away, right? Why do we even care about this right now? So maybe going to Rebecca, when you're looking at these things, these regulations, even Local Law 97 that everybody is afraid of, really only hits that top tier in 2030, and that's like 7 years away, right? So why do we care about this stuff now? Is it because you've just got long lead times on buildings, or do you actually need to start implementing this stuff immediately for some other reason?
So some of it is that there is a long lead time for the technology. Some of the tech we want to wait on a tiny bit to meet those requirements, but there are plenty of things we can do now to move us towards compliance that are worthwhile. So not just worthwhile for energy expense savings on the bottom line, because that's kind of the old school, what we've always looked at. But now when we look at both our whole portfolio emissions targets and we look at whole building data, and that's what counts for compliance with these local regulations, we're now talking about our residents' usage, which never was on the table before because we don't pay their utilities. And so we're now incentivized to figure out incentives that make projects underwrite, that lower their utilities, create comfort, better environment for them that they're living in. And so there's this extra benefit that can be done now in markets with BEPS because there are incentives and ways to make project make sense. When you're talking about the utility incentives, the state incentives, and fine avoidance, all of a sudden a project for our residents that previously did not make any sense does, and then there's added value in reducing their expenses and creating that better environment.
Yeah, and maybe just to double click on that, it sounds like all of a sudden you've got to start caring about what your tenants are doing. You've never had to do that before, but for the real estate industry, your tenants are your customers, right? Is there some sort of level here where the tenants are demanding that you are cleaner and greener, and there's sort of like a self-fulfilling prophecy here, or is it that you really are doing this because the SEC ultimately might ask you to report on this, right?
That also, but yeah, it's a little more tough with multifamily than with commercial. I think a lot of commercial tenants come in and that's what their expectations are, that it's LEED certified. We don't have a lot of residents walking in to rent an apartment and asking if it's LEED certified. But there is a benefit in them wanting their utility expenses to decrease. And a recent survey we did of our residents where they check on kind of priorities, that energy conservation was #1 as one of the top priorities in their mind. And so that kind of validates that what we're doing is important to our residents. And there is some benefit, but we don't yet have that kind of rent premium we can necessarily see because it's a LEED certified building or a more energy efficient building.
Yeah, absolutely. Got it. So let's maybe go to some more sort of like practical things here, Jeff. I've spoken to a lot of facilities managers in the real estate industry. These tend to be brass tacks kind of people. They don't care about much other than, keeping the lights on and the bottom line. How is it that you can go and sell some fancy, newfangled piece of sensor, AI-driven building management system thing to them? Why should they even care?
Well, it's a good question. So let me tell you how you don't do it. You don't do it by telling them you have to do it because the government's going to get you in trouble if you don't. So just to be clear, that is like the worst strategy and is the only time that we ever missed our sales goals. We saw in Local Law 97, the prescriptive plan, a online control is a requirement. So I was like, oh, wow, this is great. And we all thought we were going to sit back and people were going to call and say, I saw I needed to do it. It's not going to work like that. And 2030 is also a bad pitch because half the time people say, I don't know if I'm going to own the building until then. So if you're selling on a rebate or you're selling on a you have to do it, you're not going to have a good experience. You have to sell on value and focus. And at the end of the day, equity residential or any large property owner makes money by keeping tenants happy, low turnover, high occupancy rates. And it's hard to run buildings finding out that there's no heat or hot water because a tenant calls you, you'd rather get an email notification. So whether if you're pitching Runwise or anything in the climate space, you have to make their lives easier. You have to establish value. And then as a nice add-on, oh, by the way, there could be a cost savings here. So an example of a Runwise is a live text alert that a boiler is leaking or a system is not operational. It allows you to get proactive and fix problems before tenants call you and say they have no heat or hot water or anything like that. So it's being proactive. We allow operators to see everything that's happening in their property, apartment temperatures, space temperatures, domestic hot water, so they can be proactive in solving problems rather than getting phone calls and switching levers and calling vendors and just going back and forth. So it's really, our goal is to always try and sell on value, not on a requirement. So just like Rebecca said, we could have had a huge plan for Cambridge compliance, and that can go out the window. Local Law 97 could be diminished in a year from now, but if there's an operational cost savings for building owners, that's going to make you less dependent on regulation.
Yeah, 100% agreed here. And I think what we have a bit of a tongue-in-cheek thing at Fifthwall when we're looking at technologies to invest in, and the tongue-in-cheek thing is you should be able to sell this product to an active climate change denying CFO and they should still want to buy it, right? And for many of these technologies, really what you're looking at is what are these ancillary other savings you might be getting? Yes, there are energy cost savings. Yes, you get to avoid some fines. Maybe you get to unlock some free money, but then also, hey, can I stop an apartment flooding, right? Yeah. Or can I stop a liability insurance claim because I scalded a tenant with too hot water, things like that. So let's move on then to Adam. You actually said something earlier on that I apologize, I skipped over. You sort of threw it out there, real-time data, and said it was important. Why is it important? Because I feel like lots of people claim they have data. As you said, we call up the utilities or we get our monthly bills or maybe quarterly bills. Why does real-time data matter?
Real-time data matters because when you're running your business, you don't want to know that you're going to miss your quarterly target after you've finished that quarter, right? You want to know what's happening as it's happening. You want to understand whether it's building performance or enterprise-wide performance of your organization, especially when sustainability is one of those goals in which people are being judged, and it ties into some of these other pieces. It was funny, you just talked about the climate-hating CFO, and I met with one of those 2 weeks ago. It's one of our customers, one of our really good customers, actually. Does not in any way believe in climate change, but he does have an economic incentive tied to it. And what we were able to do is they were using a platform where they were getting data, doing once a year annual reporting. And what we were able to do was say, by understanding how your building's performing in real time, on an hourly basis, we can understand when people are in the building, when they're not in the building, what the heating and cooling sensitivity curve is, and helping them to make decisions. We were able to isolate that to make recommendations that help them not only to reduce their environmental impact and get within his actual bonus range, but also to reduce the operational cost of that building by leveraging different tax incentives to be able to do it. And he literally, we were at breakfast at the Hyatt right there at the DFW airport, and he looked at me and he says, I don't believe in climate change, but I do now, right? And that was what got him there, was because he was financially incentivized both personally and for the company to be able to make decisions that reduce that impact. And it's only because we were able to understand his business as he actually runs it, not as an annual look back or a quarterly look back. But we understood that business, what it looks like when people are in the buildings and when they're not in the buildings. And that is what allowed us to use that data to help him hit his goals.
Yeah, absolutely. And last real question before I do sort of rapid fire at the end. But Rebecca, over to you here. You again sort of said this in passing, I think, in your first question that you answered, but compliance and regulation used to be siloed, but now it sounds like it's more integrated across all of equity residential. Has this risen to the level now where this is sort of a board level discussion that the CEO and CFO and the board is really discussing all the time? Or is it just, that the internal silos have been broken, but it hasn't really risen up in importance across the entire firm?
No, I think it's driven to the CEO level. We have a lot of investors that are asking for this information, wanting to understand what we're doing proactively to be prepared. And so I get filtered down a bunch of questions from investors and lenders that want updates on which buildings are out of compliance with which cycles. I mean, they get real specific. And so it is at the point where it's a kind of board level, they're aware of it. And it's kind of rolled into other kind of ESG goals, but I am getting much more frequent questions from those external parties asking and making sure that we're being proactive and prepared.
Fantastic. Okay, with 2 minutes left here, Cody, I'm gonna start down the line here, and just from each one of you, let's go with what is either your favorite pool of free money out there right now, or your scariest regulatory stick as you look across everything going on in the space?
Yeah, so my favorite pool of free money is the Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations, because it's not loan guarantees, it's not, it's just grants. It's free. And I really like that because it's maximally free. And the Inflation Reduction Act gave $6 billion to build plants for cement, steel, and aluminum to that office. So that's pretty good. And then scariest regulation is that it's actually in Europe. There's a regulation that says that says that supplementary cementitious material, which is a key ingredient in cement, is defined as the waste product from a coal-fired power plant. So this is not true in the United States, and there's a lot of words saying like, do we need to define that way? I don't know. But that's something that's keeping some old things stuck around that we don't like too much.
Favorite is the IRA, because as much as it is beneficial for the private sector, and you can see this in so many different forms of implementation, on the public sector, where we also do a lot of work with our customers, there is so much money. In fact, $4.6 billion right now for states and communities to be able to do additional grants. It is truly the most transformative thing in U.S. history.
Sure. My favorite rebate are utility rebates. The IRA and a lot of these state and federal grants get a lot of attention, but there are oftentimes a lot of local rebates through utilities, Con Edison, National Grid, Eversource, that are very, very generous, don't require a lot of paperwork, and allow you to get basic projects funded quickly. So that's the one we're most excited about. I'm most concerned with 2024, even though a lot of buildings are in compliance. Literally in a few months, a gallon of oil or a therm of gas will be on the clock, and that's actually never happened before. So seeing it in place is the biggest, scariest stick, in my opinion.
Yeah, and apologies to cut you off, Rebecca. Just to give you the order of magnitude, because I said it in the opening, the IRA has $8 billion of these rebates for building owners for things like heat pumps, but the utility incentives are $30 billion per year. So order of magnitude here, we should be going after the utility stuff, step one, right? Go ahead, Rebecca.
So I think right now my favorite bucket of free money is NYSERDA, the New York State program. Theirs is just very open and creative, and they're willing to try to work together with the owners to try to solve big problems and set pathways for slightly smaller owners to learn from and benefit from. And then my scariest regulation, I think that's owner specific, really. For us, Denver has some very, very aggressive emissions reductions targets that start in 2025. And it's difficult, just the types of buildings that we have in Denver. We're logistically trying to figure out how to get there.
Fantastic. Thank you to our fantastic panel, and also I apologize to everybody that now the best panel of the day is over.